Greetings, I am Gresham's Adam, and welcome back to Gresham Reads Graceling by Kristen Cashore. Okay, there it goes. I need to turn it up a little bit when doing this, so that I can actually pick up the music. Right. So, last time we had a glimpse into the latest job that Randa had sent his niece Katza on towards. The punishment of I believe it was a Midlands. No, not a Midlands. Where is it? It's still in Borderlord, I believe. Who had taken more lumber from the court than originally agreed. Katza was originally sent to punish him, but due to a moral debate among herself, she did punish him, but in a sense that Randa would not have been pleased with, as she felt that he had, with twice the pay that he agreed upon with the king, and the fact that he was being humiliated in such a way, that Katza felt that a mere blow to the forehead, enough to knock him unconscious but not kill him or harm him in the long run, would have been enough. And in all honesty, that is something I respect. Were I in Randa's place, I honestly would have simply demanded compensation and given a warning, as no doubt this was just the first. This was honestly the first attempt at such a thing, and not a repeated attempt. Were it multiple attempts, then perhaps I would exact some form of punishment beyond simple monetary recompensation, or monetary compensation, forgive me. But enough of that. Let us continue with Chapter 6, and quite possibly Chapter 7, if they remain as short as they are. The sun was well on its way across the sky when their horses clattered onto the marble floor of Randa's inner courtyard. Around them on all sides, the white castle walls rose and stood brightly against the green marble of the floor. Balconied passageways lined the walls above, so that the people of the court could look down into the courtyard as they moved from one section of the castle to another, and admire Randa's great garden of crawling vines and pink flowering trees. A statue of Randa stood in the center of the garden, a fountain of water flowing from one outstretched hand and a torch in the other. It was an attractive garden, if one did not dwell on the statue, and an attractive courtyard, but not a peaceful or private one, with the entire court roaming the passageways above. This was not the only such courtyard in the castle, but it was the largest, and it was the entrance point for any important residents or visitors. The green floor was kept to such a shine that Katza could see herself and her horse reflected in its surface. The white walls were made of a stone that sparkled, and they rose so high that she had to crane her neck to find the tops of the turrets above. It was very grand, very impressive, as Randa liked it. The noise of their horses and their shouts brought people to the balconies to see who had come. A steward came out to greet them. A moment later, Raffin came flying into the courtyard. "You've arrived." Katza grinned at him. Then she looked closer, stood on her toes, for he was so very tall. She grabbed a handful of his hair. "Raff, what have you done to yourself? Your hair is positively blue." "I've been trying a new remedy for a headache," he said, "to be massaged into the scalp. Yesterday I thought I felt a headache coming on, so I tried it. Apparently it turns fair hair blue." She smiled. "Did it cure the headache?" "Well, if I had a headache, then it did. But I'm not convinced I had one to begin with." "Do you have a headache?" he asked hopefully. "Your hair is so dark, it wouldn't turn nearly as blue." "I don't. I never do." "What does the king think of your hair?" Raffin smirked. "He's not speaking to me. He says it's appalling behavior for the son of the king. Until my hair is normal again, I'm not his son." Ol and Gideon greeted Raffin and handed their reins to a boy. They followed the king's steward into the castle, leaving Katza and Raffin alone in the courtyard, near the garden and the splashing of Randa's fountain. Katza lowered her voice and pretended to be focused on the straps that tied her saddlebags to her horse. "Any news?" "He hasn't woken," Raffin said. "Not once." She was disappointed. She kept her voice low. "Have you heard of a lineed noble graced with fighting?" "You saw him, did you?" Raffin said, and she swung her eyes to his face, surprised. "As you came into the courtyard, he's been lurking around. Hard to look that one in the eyes, eh? He's the son of the lineed king." He was here? She hadn't expected that. She focused on her saddlebags once more. "Rosair?" "Great Hills, no. He has 6 older brothers. His name is the silliest I've heard for the 7th heir to the throne. Prince Greening Grandmalion." Raffin smiled. "Have you ever heard the like? Why is he here?" "Ah," Raffin said. "It's quite interesting, really. He claims to be searching for his kidnapped grandfather." Katza looked up from her bags into his laughing blue eyes. "You haven't? Of course not. I've been waiting for you." A boy came for her horse, and Raffin launched into a monologue about the visitors. About the visitors she had missed while she was gone. Then a steward approached from one of the entrances. "You'll be for you," Raffin said, "for I'm not my father's son at the moment, and he doesn't send stewards for me." He laughed and then left her. "I'm glad you're back," he called to her, and he disappeared through an archway. The steward was one of Randa's dry, sniffy little men. "Lady Katza," he said, "welcome back. The king wishes to know if your business in the east was successful. You may tell him it was successful, Katza said. Very good, my lady. The king wishes you to dress for dinner. Katza narrowed her eyes at the steward. Does the king wish anything else? No, my lady. Thank you, my lady. The man bowed and scampered away from her gaze as quickly as possible. Katza lifted her bags onto her shoulder and sighed. When the king wished her to dress for dinner, it meant she was to wear a dress and arrange her hair and wear jewels in her ears and around her neck. It meant the king planned to sit her next to some underlord who wished a wife, though she was probably not the wife he had in mind. She would ease the poor man's fears quickly, and perhaps she could claim not to feel well enough to sit through the entire meal. She wished she could take Raffin's headache remedy and turn her hair blue. It would give her a respite from Miranda's dinners. Raffin appeared again, a floor above her, on the balconied passageway that ran past his workrooms. He leaned over the railing and called down to her. Cat! What is it? You look lost. Have you forgotten the way to your rooms? I'm stalling. How long will you be? I'd like to show you a couple of my new discoveries. I've been told to make myself pretty for dinner. He grinned. Well, in that case, you'll be ages. His face dissolved into laughter, and she tore a button from one of her bags and hurled it at him. He squealed and dropped to the floor, and the button hit the wall right where he'd been standing. When he peeked over the railing, she stood in the courtyard with her hands on her hips, grinning. I missed on purpose, she said. Show off? Come if you've time. He waved and turned into his rooms. And that's when the presence in the corner of Katza's eye took shape. He was standing a floor above her, to her left. He leaned his elbows on the railing, the neck of his shirt open, and watched her. The gold hoops in his ears and the rings on his fingers. His hair dark, a tiny welt visible on his forehead, just beside his eye. His eyes. Katza had never seen such eyes. One was silver, and the other gold. They glowed in the sun-darkened face, uneven and strange. She was surprised that they hadn't shone in the darkness of their first meeting. They didn't seem human. She couldn't stop looking at them. A steward of the court came to him then and spoke to him. He straightened, turned to the man, and said something in response. When the steward walked away, the lion's eyes flashed back to Katza. He leaned his elbows on the railing again. Katza knew she was standing in the courtyard center, staring at this lionid. She knew she should move, but she found that she couldn't. Then he raised his eyebrows a hair, and his mouth shifted into the hint of a smirk. He nodded at her, just barely, and it released her from her spell. Cocky, she thought. Cocky and arrogant, this one, and that was all there was to make of him. Whatever game he was playing, if he expected her to join him, he would be disappointed. Grinning grinned Malian indeed. She tore her eyes away from his, hitched her bags higher, and pushed herself forward into the castle, all the while conscious of the strange eyes burning into her back. Forgive me, my sinuses are a little disturbed at the moment. Alright, Chapter 7. Hilda had come to work in Randa's nurseries around the same time Katza began to dole out Randa's punishments. It was hard to know why she had been less frightened of Katza than others were. Perhaps it was because she had borne a Graceling child of her own. Not a fighter, only a swimmer, a skill that was of no use to the king. So the boy had been sent home, and Hilda had seen how the neighbors avoided and ridiculed him, simply because he could move through the water like a fish, or because he had one eye black and the other blue. Perhaps this was why when the servants had warned Hilda to avoid the king's niece, Hilda had reserved her opinion. Of course, Katza had been too old for the nurseries when Hilda arrived. And where was I? And the children of the court had kept Hilda busy. But she'd come to Katza's training sessions when she could. She'd sat and watched the child beat the stuffing out of a dummy, grain bursting from cracks and tears in the sack, and slapping onto the floor like spurting blood. She'd never stayed long, because she's always needed to return to the nursery. But still, Katza had noticed her, as she noticed anyone who didn't try to avoid her. Had noticed and noted her, but hadn't troubled herself with curiosity. Katza had no reason to interact with a woman servant. One day, Hilda had come when Ol was away, and Katza was alone in the practice rooms. And when the child had paused to set up a new dummy, Hilda had spoken. "In court they say you're dangerous, my lady." Katza considered the old woman for a moment, her gray hair and gray eyes, and her soft arms folded over a soft stomach. The woman held her gaze, as no one other than Raffin, Ol, or the king did. Then Katza shrugged, hoisted a sack of grain over her shoulder, and hung it from a hook on a wooden post standing in the center of the practice room floor. "The first man you killed, my lady," Hilda said. "That cousin. Did you mean to kill him?" It was a question no one had ever actually asked her. Again, the girl looked into the face of the woman, and again, the woman held her eyes. Katza sensed that this question was inappropriate, coming from a servant, but she was so unused to being talked to that she didn't know the right way to proceed. "No," Katza said. "I only meant to keep him from touching me." "Then you are dangerous, my lady, to people you don't like. But perhaps you'd be safe as a friend." "It's why I spend my days in this practice room," Katza said. "Mastering your grace," Hilda said. "Yes, all Gracelings must do so." This woman knew something about the Graces, and she wasn't afraid to say the word. It was time for Katza to begin her exercises again. But she paused, hoping the woman would say something more. Katza waited. "My lady," Hilda said, "if I may ask you a nosy question." Katza waited. She couldn't think of a question more nosy than the one the woman had already asked. "Who are your servants, my lady?" Hilda asked. Katza wondered if this woman was trying to embarrass her. She drew herself up and looked the woman straight in the face, daring her to laugh or smile. I don't keep servants. When a servant is assigned to me, she generally chooses to leave the service of the court. Hilda didn't smile or laugh. She merely looked back at Katza, studied her for a moment. Have you any female caretakers, my lady? I have none. Has anyone spoken to you of a woman's bleedings, my lady, or of how it is with a man and a woman? Katza didn't know what she meant, and she had a feeling this old woman could tell. Still, Hilda didn't smile or laugh. She looked Katza up and down. What is your age, my lady? Katza raised her chin. I'm nearly 11. And where were they? And they were going to let you learn it on your own, and probably tear through the castle like a wild thing because you didn't know what attacked you. Katza raised her chin another notch. I always know what attacks me. My child, Hilda said. My lady, would you allow me to serve you on occasion, when you need service and when my presence is not required in the nurseries? Katza thought it must be very bad to work in the nurseries, if this woman wished to serve her instead. I don't need servants, she said, but I can have you transferred from the nurseries if you are unhappy there. Katza thought she caught the hint of a smile. I'm happy in the nurseries, Hilda said. Forgive me for contradicting such a one as yourself, my lady, but you do need a servant, a woman servant, because you have no mother or sisters. Katza had never needed a mother or sisters, or anyone else either. She didn't know what one did with a contradictory servant. She guessed that Randa would go into a rage, but she was afraid of her own rages. She held her breath, clenched her fist, and stood as still as the wooden post in the center of the room. The woman could say what she wanted. They were only words. Hilda stood and smoothed her dress. I'll come to your room on occasion, my lady. Katza made her face like a rock. If you ever wish a break from your uncle's state dinners, you may always join me in my room. Katza blinked. She hated the dinners, with everyone's sideways glances, and the people who didn't want to sit near her. And her uncle's loud voice. Could she really skip them? Could this woman's company be better? I must return to the nurseries, my lady, Hilda said. My name is Hilda, and I come from the Western Midlands. Your eyes are so very pretty, my dear. Goodbye. Hilda left before Katza was able to find her voice. Katza stared at the door that closed behind her. Thank you, she said, though there was no one to hear her. And though she wasn't sure why, her voice seemed to think she was grateful. Katza sat in the bath and tugged at the knots in her tangle of hair. She heard Hilda in the other room, rustling through chests and drawers, unearthing the earrings and necklaces Katza had thrown among her silk undergarments and her horrid bone chest supports the last time she'd been required to wear them. Forgive me, I was adjusting my seat. Katza heard Hilda muttering and grunting, on her knees most likely, looking under the bed for Katza's hairbrush or her dinner shoes. What dress shall it be tonight, my lady? Helda called out. You know I don't care, Katza called back. There was more muttering in response to this. A moment later, Helda came to the door carrying a dress bright as the tomatoes Randa imported from Lyned. The tomatoes that clustered on the vines and tasted as rich and sweet as his chef's chocolate cake. Katza raised her eyebrows. I'm not going to wear a red dress, she said. It's the color of sunrise, Helda said. It's the color of blood, Katza said. Sighing, Helda carried the dress from the bathing room. You would look stunning, my lady, with your dark hair and your eyes, she called. Katza yanked at one of the more stubborn knots in her hair. She spoke to the bubbles gathered on the surface of the water. If there's anyone I wish to stun at dinner, I'll hit him in the face. Helda came to the doorway again, this time with her arms full of a soft green silk. Is this dull enough for you, my lady? Have I no grays or browns? Helda set her face. I am determined that you wear a color, my lady. Katza scowled. You're determined that people notice me. She held a tangle of hair before her eyes and pulled at it savagely. I should like to cut it all off, she said. It's not worth the nuisance. Helda put the dress aside and came to sit on the edge of the bath. She lathered her fingers with soap and took the tangled hair out of Katza's hand. She worked the curls apart, bit by bit, gently. If you ran a brush through it once every day while you were traveling, my lady, this wouldn't happen. Katza snorted. Gideon would get a good laugh out of that. My attempts to beautify myself. That knot untangled. Helda moved to another. Don't you think Lord Gideon finds you beautiful, my lady? Helda, Katza said, how much time do you suppose I spend wondering which of the gentlemen finds me beautiful? Not enough, Helda said, nodding empathically. A hiccup of laughter rose into Katza's throat. Dear Helda, she saw what Katza was and what she did, and Helda didn't deny that Katza was that person. But she couldn't fathom a lady who didn't want to be beautiful, who didn't want a legion of admirers. And so she believed Katza was both people, though Katza couldn't imagine how she reconciled them in her mind. In the great dining hall, Randa presided over a long, high table that might as well have been a stage at the head of the room. 3 low tables are arranged around the perimeter to complete the sides of a square, giving the guests an unobstructed view of the king. Randa was a tall man, taller even than his son, and broader in the shoulders and the neck. He had Raffin's yellow hair and blue eyes, but they weren't laughing like Raffin's. They were eyes that assumed you would do what he told you to do. Eyes that threatened to bring you unhappiness if he didn't get what he wanted. It wasn't that he was unjust, except perhaps to those who wronged him. It was more that he wanted things the way he wanted them. And if things weren't that way, he might decide that he had been wronged. And if you were the person responsible, well, then you had reason to fear his eyes. At dinner, he wasn't fearsome. At dinner he was arrogant and loud. He brought whomever he wanted to sit with him at the high table, often Raffin, though Randa spoke over him and never cared to hear what he had to say. Rarely Katza. Randa kept his distance from her. He preferred to look down on his lady killer and call out to her, because his yelling brought the attention of the entire room to his niece, his prized weapon. And the guests would be frightened, and everything would be as Randa liked it. Tonight, she sat at the table to the right of Randa's, her usual position. She wore the soft green silk and felt the urge to tear off the sleeves that widened at her wrists and hung over her hands, and dragged across her plate if she wasn't careful. At least this dress covered her breasts, mostly. Not all of them did. Helda paid her no attention when she gave instructions about her wardrobe. Gideon sat to her left, the Lord to her right, whom she supposed to be the eligible bachelor. Was a man not old, but older than Gideon. A small man whose bugged eyes and stretched mouth gave him the appearance of a frog. Wonder if it's Brian. Who is Brian? Monsters and Mistakes joke. Okay. His name was David, and he was a border lord from the Midlands northeast corner, at the border of both Nander and Estel. His conversation wasn't bad. He cared a great deal about his land, his farms, his villages, and Katza found it easy to ask questions that he was eager to answer. At first, he sat on the furthest edge of his chair and looked at her shoulder and her ear and her hair as they talked, but never her face. But he grew calmer as the dinner progressed, and Katza didn't bite him. His body relaxed, and he settled into his chair, and they spoke easily. Katza thought him unusually good dinner company, this Lord David of the Northeast. At any rate, he made it easier for her to resist tearing out the hairpins that dug into her scalp. The lioned prince was also a distraction, no matter how much she willed him not to be. He sat across the room from her, and was always in the corner of her eye, though she tried not to look at him directly. She felt his eyes on her at times. Bold he was, and completely unlike the rest of the guests, who carefully pretended she wasn't there, as they always did. It occurred to her that it wasn't just the strangeness of his eyes that disconcerted her. It was that he wasn't afraid to hold hers. She glanced at him once when he wasn't looking. He raised his eyes to meet her gaze. David had asked the same question twice before Katza heard him and turned from the lion's uneven stare to answer. She supposed she would have to face those eyes soon. They would have to talk. She would have to decide what to do with him. She thought that Lord David, I'm not sure, it might be David, would be less nervous if he knew there was no chance of Randa offering him her suit. Lord David, she said, have you a wife? He shook his head. It's the only thing my estate lacks, my lady. Katza kept her eyes on her venison and carrots. My uncle is very disappointed in me, because I intend never to marry. Lord David paused and then spoke. I doubt your uncle is the only man who finds that disappointing. Katza considered his pointy face and could not stop herself from smiling. Lord David, she said, you are a perfect gentleman. The Lord smiled in return. You don't think I mean it. You think I don't mean it, my lady, but I did. Then he leaned in and ducked his head. My lady, I wish to speak with the council. The voices of the dinner guests were lively, but she heard him perfectly. She pretended to focus on her dinner. She stirred her soup. Sit back. Act as if we were only talking. Don't whisper, for it draws attention. The Lord settled back into his seat. He raised his finger for a serving girl, who brought him more wine. He ate a few bites of his venison and turned to Katza once more. The weather has been very kind to my aging father this summer, my lady. He suffers from the heat, but it's been cool in the northwest. He said. I'm happy to hear it, Katza. Katza said. Is it information or a request? The Lord spoke around his mouth full of carrots. Information. He sliced another piece of venison. It becomes more and more difficult to care for him, my lady. Why is that? The elderly are prone to discomforts. It's our duty to keep them comfortable, he said, and safe. Katza nodded. True words indeed. She kept her face even, but excitement rattled at the edges of her mind. If he had information of the kidnapping of the Lionid grandfather, they would all want to hear it. She reached under the heavy tablecloth and rested her hand on Gideon's knee. Without turning away from he leaned toward her slightly, without turning away from the lady on his other side. You're a man of great information, Lord David, she said to the Lord, or rather to her plate, so that Gideon could hear. I hope we'll have the opportunity to speak with you more during your stay at court. Thank you, my lady, Lord David said. I hope so too. Gideon would spread the word. They would meet that night in her own room, because they were secluded, and because they were the only rooms not traveled by servant. If she could find Raffin beforehand, she'd like to visit Grandfather Tilif. Even if he was still sleeping, it would be good to see with her own eyes how he was faring. Katza heard the king speak her name, and her shoulders stiffened. She didn't look at him, for she didn't wish to encourage him to draw her into his conversation. She couldn't make out his words. Most likely he was telling some guest of the story of something she'd done. His laughter rolled across the tables in a great marble hall. Katza tried to push back the scowl that rose to her face. The Lionid prince was watching her. She felt that too. Heat licked at her neck and crawled along her scalp. My lady, Lord David said, are you quite all right? You look a bit flushed. Gideon turned to her, his face flashing with concern. He reached for her arm. You weren't ill? She pulled back from him. I'm never ill, she snarled, and she knew suddenly that she must leave the hall. She must leave the clutter of voices, the sound of her uncle's laugh, Gideon's smothering concern. the Lionid's burning eyes. She must go outside, find Raffin, or be on her own. She must, or she would lose her temper, and something unthinkable would happen. She stood, and Gideon and Lord Davit stood with her. Across the room, the Lionid prince stood. One by one, the rest of the men saw her standing, and rose. The room quieted. Everyone was looking at her. "What is it, Katsa?" Gideon asked, reaching for her arm again, so that she wouldn't be shamed in front of everyone. In the hall, she allowed him to take it, though his hand was like a brand that burned her into her skin. "It's nothing," she said. "I'm sorry." She turned to the king, the only man in the room who wasn't on his feet. "Forgive me, Lord King," she said. "It's nothing. Please sit down." She waved her hand around the tables. "Please." Slowly, the gentleman sat, and the voice picked up again. The king's laugh rang out, directed at her, and she was sure. Katsa turned to Lord David. "Please excuse me, my lord." She turned to Gideon, whose hand still grasped her elbow. "Let go, Gideon. I want to take a walk outside." "I'll go with you," he said. He started to rise, but at the warning in her eyes, he sat back down again. "Very well, Katsa. Do what you will." There was an edge to his voice. She had probably been rude, but she didn't care. All that mattered was that she leave this room and go to a place where she couldn't hear the drone of her uncle's voice. She turned and carefully walked to catch the eye, careful not to catch the eyes of the Lionid. She forced herself to walk slowly, calmly, to the doorway at the foot of the room. Once through the doorway, she ran. She ran through corridors, around corners, past servants who flattened themselves trembling against the walls as she flew by. Finally, she burst into the darkness of the courtyard. She crossed the marble floor, pulling pins from her hair. She sighed as her curls fell from her shoulders, and the tension left her scalp. It was the hairpins, and the dress, and the shoes that pinched her feet. It was having to hold her head still and straight. It was the infuriating earrings that brushed against her neck. That was why she couldn't stand to spend one moment longer at her uncle's fine dinner. She took off her earrings and hurled them into her uncle's fountain. She didn't care who found them. But that was no good, because people would talk. The entire court would speculate about what it meant. That she'd thrown her earrings into her uncle's fountain. Katsa kicked off her shoes, hitched up her skirt, and climbed into the fountain, sighing as the cold water ran between her toes and lapped at her ankles. It was a great improvement over her shoes. She would not put them on again tonight. She waded out to the glimmer she saw in the water and retrieved her earrings, dried them on her skirt, dropped them into the bodice of her dress for safekeeping, and stood in the fountain, enjoying the coolness enveloping her feet, the drifting air of the courtyard, the night noises. Until a sound from inside reminded her of how much the court would talk if she were found wading, barefoot and wild-haired, in King Randa's fountain. They would think her mad, and perhaps she was mad. A light shone from Raffin's workrooms, but it wasn't his company she sought after all. She didn't want to sit and talk. She wanted to move. Movement would stop the worrying in her mind. Katza climbed out of the fountain and hung the straps of her shoes over her wrists. She ran. Alright, it seems that the chapters are getting slightly longer. But I do hope you've enjoyed so far. I do find this story fascinating. Forgive me, sitting down in one spot for extended periods of time can be exhausting. But I do hope you have enjoyed the story so far. The nuances of the kingdom of Midlands, Randus Kingdom. It's interesting to hear of the parties he hosts, dinners, and how... Oh, forgive me, I did not mean to knock that over. And how code has been developed by Katza and the members either seeking or working with the council of Katzas are able to speak directly in front of the king without him knowing what was happening. It is honestly fascinating, and I cannot wait to read more. But I believe I will call it here. So, thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video and the story, be sure to leave a like and a comment down below telling your favorite part. And if you enjoy the content Darkus and myself post, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you always know when we record and upload. I believe that will be it, so I will see you all in the next video. I am Gresham, and I am signing out.